There was a time when truth was not found in words, but in wounds. When arguments could end not with parchment or prayer, but with blood in the dirt and silence, heavy as a church bell after dusk. This was the world of trial by combat, a strange world, one where men believed that God himself would guide the hand of the righteous, where guilt and innocence were not decided by logic or proof or a judge in robes, but by who could still stand when the sun went down. It sounds brutal, and it was, but it was also beautifully absurd, because in the centuries between superstition and reason, people found the most peculiar ways to prove a point. A knight might challenge a farmer, a woman might challenge her accuser, and once, at least according to the oddest of chronicles, a man challenged his own horse. Yes, his horse. And the strangest part? It might have actually happened. Let's go back to the 13th century, to a Europe still echoing with the clang of iron and prayer. Trial by combat was not new. It had roots deep in Germanic law. When two people disagreed over land, over honor, over who stole whose chicken, they could appeal to God as the final judge. They would meet in a field, sometimes barefoot, sometimes armored. Each would swear an oath to their truth. And then the rest was up to fate. If you won, you were right. If you lost, you're not only wrong, you're also probably dead. But to the medieval mind, that made sense. God, they believed, would never let an innocent person lose. So the duel wasn't just violence, it was divine arbitration. The sword was a holy witness. The shield, a form of prayer. And like all human inventions meant to honor heaven, it sometimes went terribly, terribly wrong. Because humans, as it turns out, are very creative when it comes to fighting. Not every combatant was equal. Some were noble, some were not. So, the rules adapted. If a nobleman accused a peasant, the peasant could send a champion to fight in his place. And if a woman was accused, well, she couldn't be expected to wear armor and swing a sword. So, special trials were arranged. One famous case tells of a woman who fought her accuser in a pit, the man standing above her with one hand tied behind his back, while she swung a rock wrapped in cloth. It sounds ridiculous, but it was deadly serious. Another account describes a monk accused of murder who challenged his opponent, then promptly ran away mid-duel, perhaps realizing divine judgment wasn't going his way. And then, of course, there was the knight and his horse. The story appears in a few scattered sources, half serious, half legend. It tells of a knight, his name mostly lost, who accused his own horse of betrayal. Some say the horse threw him in battle. Others claim it fled from combat, leaving its master to face the enemy alone. And so, in a fit of wounded honor, the knight demanded trial by combat against the creature that had shamed him. A priest tried to intervene. A steward whispered that perhaps it was madness, but the knight was adamant. He donned his armor, he called for the lists to be drawn, and he faced his horse across the field. Imagine it. A proud destrier snorting in confusion, the air thick with the smell of mud and iron, as the crowd watches, not quite sure whether to laugh or to pray. Did he truly strike at the animal? Did he simply shout oaths at it, declaring his innocence before God? We do not know. The chronicles end abruptly. Perhaps because even the scribes could not quite believe what they were writing, but the story lingered. It became one of those medieval oddities whispered across monasteries and courts. Proof that faith, when mixed with pride, could lead men into absurd places. And yet, in its strange way, it made sense to them. Because to a medieval knight, honor was life. And if a horse had shamed him, it was not merely a beast's fault. It was a moral failing, something the heavens themselves must weigh. Now, before you think all this was chaos, there were rules. Many of them, in fact. A trial by combat had to be sanctioned by a court or lord. The time and place were chosen carefully. Weapons were regulated, sometimes swords, sometimes maces, sometimes clubs wrapped in linen. And there were rituals. Before the duel, each fighter swore an oath that his cause was just. False oaths, they believed, would damn the liar's soul and doom his body in combat. The ground itself was consecrated. Priests watched. Sometimes the duel would begin with a prayer, sometimes with silence so deep you could hear the armor creak. And if one man fell, the crowd would not cheer. They would watch quietly. As God's judgment revealed itself in flesh and blood, it was a terrifying kind of faith, but also, in its way, peaceful. Because once the battle was over, there was no argument left, no appeal, no endless bureaucracy, only stillness. By the late Middle Ages, though, even kings began to doubt. Records from France, Germany, and England show that by the 14th century, the duel had become more pageant than proof. Lawyers preferred written oaths. Judges began to roll their eyes at nobles demanding divine intervention. But some clung to it, especially those whose pride or desperation left no other choice. The last officially sanctioned trial by combat in England took place in 1446 between Thomas FitzThomas and another knight. Both were armored, both swore oaths before God. Neither survived long enough to learn who was right. And yet, in 1817, a man in Staffordshire named Abraham Thornton invoked his ancient right to trial by combat. Hundreds of years after the custom had faded, his request was denied. But for a brief, strange moment, the ghost of the old god's battlefield stirred again. So maybe the knight and his horse weren't so strange after all, because behind every trial by combat, there was something deeply human. The desperate need for justice, for certainty, for an ending that felt true, whether it was between men or beasts, or the quiet struggle of belief itself. When you think of a duel, you might imagine honor, steel, and sunlight glinting on a blade. But the world of medieval combat wasn't always so noble. Sometimes it was muddy, uneven, and sometimes the challenger didn't even walk on two legs, because not all of God's judgments involved men. Sometimes it was animals who fought for the truth. It happened, they say, in 14th century France. A knight named Aubry de Montdidier was found dead, murdered in a lonely forest outside Paris. No witnesses, no tracks, nothing, except his loyal greyhound, who refused to leave his master's body. The dog followed the funeral, it lingered at the grave, and then it began to behave strangely. Every time it saw one man, Chevalier Macaire, a fellow knight, it would snarl and bare its teeth. It lunged at him in the streets and barked whenever his name was spoken. People noticed, whispers spread, and in a world that still half believed in miracles and signs, that was enough. The King of France at the time, Charles V, was intrigued. He ordered a strange trial, one between the dog and the accused knight. It was to be a trial by combat. Man versus animal, right versus wrong, God versus guilt. The lists were drawn. Macaire stood in armor, his face pale, his hand gripping a club. The greyhound, small but furious, waded across the ring. At the signal, the dog leapt. It darted between Macaire's legs, biting, clawing, tearing. He struck at it, but the animal was faster, driven by something beyond fear. When the fight was done, Macaire was bleeding and screaming, and he confessed. The dog had won. Justice, they said, had been done. For centuries, this tale was retold, part myth, part law, part bedtime terror. It became proof that even beasts, in their innocence, could serve as God's instrument. And perhaps, in that moment, truth itself had 4 legs and a faithful heart. But not all duels were so romantic. Some were grim, desperate, and strangely domestic. One account, written in a Bavarian court record from the 13th century, tells of a woman accused of killing her husband. The law allowed her a choice, confess or fight. And so, a pit was dug, a hole, waist deep, lined with straw. The woman was placed inside, wearing only a linen shift. Her accuser, a man who claimed to speak for her dead husband, stood above her, armed with a club. But to make it fair, one of his arms was bound to his side. The signal was given, and for a long time, nothing moved. Then, a lunge, a swing, a scream. The woman struck first. She caught his leg, pulled him into the pit, and beat him until he lay still. When it was over, she was declared innocent, not because of evidence, not because of reason, but because God had let her win. It sounds barbaric now, cruel, almost absurd. But to them, it was simply justice, the kind that left no doubt. And maybe that certainty was worth the madness. By the 15th century, Europe began to wake from this old dream. The church no longer favored such trials. Judges called them tempting God. And kings, those pragmatic keepers of chaos, saw they caused more trouble than truth. But habits die hard. Even after official bans, private duels continued, hidden in fields, in barns, by torchlight. Honor, after all, doesn't vanish just because a king says so. And when you strip away the armor and ceremony, what remains is something deeply human. That aching need to be right, to have the world itself take your side. Trial by combat was never really about winning. It was about being seen, about saying, I believe so fiercely in my truth, I will risk everything to prove it. That is not so different from today. The customs ghost lingered. Even in the age of muskets and wigs, some still felt its pull. In 1817, a bricklayer named Abraham Thornton was accused of murdering a woman named Mary Ashford. He was acquitted. But her brother, furious at the verdict, invoked an ancient right. He challenged Thornton to trial by combat. To everyone's astonishment, Thornton accepted. He appeared in court, laid down a leather glove, and declared he was ready to fight. The judge, flustered and confused, consulted old law books, and to his horror, he found that yes, the right to combat technically still existed. The challenge stood. But before the duel could be arranged, the Ashford family withdrew. The law was quietly changed soon after. Trial by combat was no more. And so ended a 1,000-year tradition, with a glove, a courtroom, and a sigh of relief. There's something haunting about it, isn't there? The idea that truth once needed a blade to prove itself. That faith was not a thought or a feeling, but a duel. It tells us something about the medieval heart. That belief was not quiet, not abstract, but physical. Something you could touch and bleed for. And maybe that's why the story of the knight and his horse still lingers. Because in its absurdity, it captures the essence of those centuries. The fragile place where reason and faith shook hands and both looked equally lost. A man fighting his horse for honor. A dog fighting for justice. A woman fighting for her life. They all stood in the same circle, beneath the same watching sky, hoping that somewhere, behind the noise and the fear, someone or something was keeping score. So now, as the candles burn low and the wind sighs against the window, perhaps think of that old field, the one marked for combat, trimpled and silent long after the fighters are gone. The grass has grown back, the swords have rusted. But if you listen closely, you might still hear the echo of a voice shouting oaths to the heavens and the faint snort of a confused horse waiting for its master's next move. Because in the end, truth is never simple as victory or defeat. Sometimes it's found in the absurd, the forgotten, the things that make no sense, and yet somehow feel perfectly human. So sleep well, traveler of history, and dream of quiet fields where justice once wore armor and faith was heavy as iron.